Right, hello everyone. I'm going to start just going through a few introductory slides while people join the meeting. So welcome everyone to our third Cambridge Zero Research Symposium of this term. This one's on the topic of law and policy. And I'll just quickly show everyone the program of speakers that we have today. So here's all the speakers who will be presenting today. So we've got Dr. Cristina Peñasco, Dr. Markus Gehring, Dr. Sarabi Ranganathan, Professor Cristiane Derani, Dr. Christopher Campbell Duraflay, Dr. Natalie Jones, and Noparuj Chindasombacharun. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So we've got a great lineup of speakers, and you can see what they will be presenting in the titles of their talks there. Now, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping rules quickly. So please do keep your microphone muted throughout the session, except when you're asking a question during the Q&A. And feel free to keep your camera switched on if you wish. It's nice to see who's in the audience, but obviously that's totally up to you whether you turn your camera on or not. During the Q&A for each of so there'll be a Q&A after each of the speakers. We'll have about 5 minutes to ask questions. And we're very keen to take as many questions as possible from the audience. So please do write your questions either in the chat. You can just type your questions, or if you'd like to ask your question yourself, please use the raise hand function, and then we can you can ask your question directly to the speakers. Please do keep your questions succinct as much as possible so that we can get through as many questions as possible and as many answers as possible. And if we do run out of time to answer all questions, then I would ask the speakers to type the answers in the chat. Also, just to let everyone know that we're recording this session for those people who couldn't attend on the day, and we'll be making the recording available on our YouTube channel after today's session. I also just wanted to quickly remind everyone that this is part of a series of research symposia that we're holding throughout the Michaelmas Term here in Cambridge. So we already had 2 sessions before today on climate science and adaptation and resilience, and the recordings for those are available on our website. Today is law and policy, and then we've got 5 more sessions coming up over the coming weeks on mitigation, nature and biodiversity, AI and sustainability, hard to abate sectors, and on working globally. That final session is together with Cambridge Global Challenges. And just to say, after today, we would encourage you to please do attend our upcoming symposia. The next one we have coming up is on Wednesday the 3rd on mitigation, and you can find all the details and register for that session and any upcoming sessions on our website. We're still looking for early career researchers to present in our symposia. We're always really keen to have as many early career researchers as we can get. So please do submit your presentations if you're interested in presenting at one of our symposia. And do also sign up for our mailing list to receive further updates about research related activities from Cambridge Zero. And you can also follow us on Twitter. I think those are all the updates from me. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll then hand over to our first speaker of today. So our first speaker in today's session is Dr. Cristina Peñasco, who is a university lecturer in public policy at the Department of Politics and International Studies, and she's also a fellow at the Center for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance. So Cristina, over to you, and please do share your screen and take it away.
Thank you very much, Eric. Please let me know if you can see the screen. Can you?
Yeah, that's all good.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in this Cambridge Zero Research Symposia. I apologize in advance because I will have to leave earlier before the end of the session. So today, given that the COP26 will take place in a couple of weeks, I want to talk about where we are right now, let's say, in terms of goals and policies, and where we are going, and how do we want to go where we want to go, with the idea of bringing some insights in terms of policy for a win-win carbon neutral future. So for that, I will be presenting a paper that was published last January in Nature Climate Change. This is joint work together with Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon and with Professor Elena Berdolini. This work was funded by the project InnoPads, a Nature 2020 project of the European Commission. And what we do here is basically systematically analyze the outcomes and trade-offs of 10 types of decarbonization policy instruments. And you might wonder, why do we need this? So I will then start with a fact. The transition to low carbon economies is a necessary condition to fight against the climate change threat. We all know that in order to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement and to reach a global warming below 2 degrees Celsius and even more the 1.5 degree goal, additional policies will be needed. Because the trickiest part of this and the current situation is that current nationally determined contributions and pledges done by countries to contribute to the Paris Agreement are not sufficient. So according to the last report published in September by the United Nations, the UNFCCC, taking into account the implementation of the latest nationally determined contributions, we can expect an increase in by 2030 in GHG emissions in comparison with the levels of 2010 of around 16%. And to be consistent with the 2 degree scenario, for example, we would need a decrease of about 25%. Of course, that's even bigger for a scenario of 1.5 degrees. With the current contributions, we are on the path of reaching a rise in temperatures of around 2.5 Celsius degrees by the end of the century. On top of that, government needs to mitigate climate change while also advancing other crucial goals, like fostering economic recovery after this economic crisis, reduce policy costs, improving competitiveness, ensure energy security, one of the debates in the last days, in an affordable way and in a fair way. So are we then in a bad situation? Well, let me use the analogy of a trip. We know where we are standing right now, what is our origin, and we know our destination. We have those targets. So let's say that this final destination are those targets, are B. Think of the UK, for example, a target of net zero carbon by 2050 would be our destination. But the current contributions will not drive us to the destination we want to reach. Maybe it will drive us to destination A and not to destination B. So what do we need? We need more stringent targets and also a strategy that includes a set of effective policy instruments that allow us to reach our destination. So in that sense, the policies could represent the means we use to reach our destination. But what is an effective policy? And how do we know a policy is effective? An effective policy in a post-crisis context like the one in which we are living, it would be one, generating positive environmental impacts, for sure, reducing GHG emissions, for sure, promoting the use of renewable energy, of course, but at the same time, it has to foster competitiveness and it has to reduce inequalities among certain communities within countries and among countries. Therefore, preventing climate change cannot be the only goal of decarbonization policies, especially because unless the transition we need is perceived as fair and affordable, as I mentioned, we will struggle to secure public support. So we need to understand the extent to which policy instruments can balance trade-offs among short-term economic goals and long-term sustainable and decarbonization societal goals. This is essential. So building on the foundations of the project I mentioned, the project InnoPads, we have explored which policy instruments are more likely to induce positive economic effects in terms of innovation, for example, or competitiveness, or reducing distributional negative impacts, while at the same time generates environmental co-benefits. So understanding the extent to which appropriate policies, regulation, public investments can do these both things at the same time is essential to bring about the changes that we need. We have been in interactions with a lot of policymakers and academics, and before we started this study, they confirmed that there were not clarity or consistency or a centralization of information on the relationship between these different policy goals and the different impacts. So to cover these gaps, we work on a systematic review, identifying what we know about the environmental, technological, competitiveness, and social outcomes of policy instruments for the low carbon transition. The paper has an associated interactive tool. You can see a small snapshot here that is open access and is intended to be a reference for policymakers, for academics, and for general users, as it allows us to foresee which are the policy environmental trade-offs and co-benefits. The evidence that we have in the database and in the paper correspond to a set of 211 papers that in total represents more than 700 evaluations or results. And the tool and the paper currently analyze the impact of 10 different policy instruments. There are many more, but we focus on these 10 that were the most widely used around many countries in the world. So we have environmental taxes, specifically carbon and energy taxes, feed-in tariffs, tradable green certificates, building codes, renewable portfolio standards, auctions, white certificates, renewable energy, R&D, government procurement and emission trading systems. All that in a set of 7 different outcomes. So as I mentioned, we have environmental outcomes, we have technological outcomes, cost-related issues with the implementation of the policies, how they incentivize innovation, competitiveness, distributional effects, and other social outcomes. Altogether, we included papers covering more than 50 countries around the world. Most papers analyze policy instruments and outcomes at the national level in OECD countries, with the US, the UK, and several European countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, or France as the top one or more frequently studied. And a very small number of papers actually focuses on countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, with the exception of South Africa and in the Middle East. So this highlights a large gap in the geographic coverage of the literature that we will need to address in the following years if we want to actually make a difference and understand what's happening, not only in the global north, but also in the global south. What we create is basically an agreement indicator that summarizes the level of agreement and the direction of the impact regarding this relationship between policy instrument and a given outcome. This was inspired by the Herfindahl Index, if you have some kind of business background. By design, the index moves from 0.33 for a full level of disagreement regarding the impact of a policy instrument on an individual outcome. So the number that we see here would be the level of disagreement. So for example, for feed-in tariffs, in terms of competitiveness, it's not very clear if the effect is actually positive. And then what we see as well is the positive, negative, or no impact type of effect, depending on the color. So the blue would be a positive impact, the orange could be a negative impact, and a gray box could be a lack of impact. There is not neither negative nor positive type of impact. Here I saw these 3 examples because are the ones that I'm going to elaborate later, but we analyzed this for the 10 different policy instruments that I mentioned before. So what do we see? A first important finding is that the available evidence displays higher levels of agreement regarding the generally positive impact of all these policies instruments on environmental outcomes, and to a lesser extent, I will not show that in technological outcomes. This result is maybe not surprising, given that the actual goal of the policies is reducing GHG emissions, which is captured by this environmental effectiveness outcome. However, what we will see is that when we move from outcomes like environmental effectiveness to outcomes like competitiveness or distributional outcomes, the picture changes. Just briefly, what we see in the slide is the number of evaluations per policy instrument and their impact, positive, negative, or no impact, with the colors that I mentioned before, in the outer cycles. The inner cycles are the methodologies. I'm not going to stop today in the methodologies themselves. So as I mentioned, we find more negative impacts and also higher level of disagreement when we move from environmental impacts to competitiveness. So we see much more orange here, and in some cases, many different colors, which means that we have higher level of disagreement. And if we go to distributional outcomes, this is even worse. Does it mean that policy instruments to foster low carbon transition will impact negatively the economy, specific sectors, or the more vulnerable? Well, I will say no, it does not mean that. The evidence indicates that short to medium term competitiveness and distributional outcomes emerge for all instruments in specific circumstances, but also suggests that policymakers can consider those trade-offs in their choice of design. So they design the policies in a way in which we start seeing these positive outcomes. What makes different these policies that generate positive ones with the policies that generate the negative one. So the key point here is design. Once we have understood the trade-offs, what are the design elements that can minimize those ones and transform them into co-benefits? Well, I will discuss here the evidence of the role of policy design on reducing trade-offs and foster competitiveness in 3 policies, but of course, these are just small examples of what can be done. So I mentioned evidence in competitiveness impacts, for example, for renewable energy deployment subsidies. I mentioned feed-in tariffs, varies a lot depending on technologies, depending on the geographical areas, but the main differences are in terms of design. So what we see is that tailored, predictable, and adjustable feed-in tariffs and auctions, for example, to support low carbon technology deployment and investment in renewable energy infrastructure are key. Cost-related outcomes are generally worse for feed-in tariffs that are not characterized by enough flexibility and responsiveness to the evolution of the cost of the technologies promoted. And to mitigate this negative cost or distributional outcomes, these feed-in tariffs needs to be designed in a technology-specific way and allow dynamic and adjustable but predictable calculation of the value of the tariff for the generator in this case and the level of support. What happened with this? This may reduce incentive to innovate because we are tightening the benefits for the companies. Thus, these policymakers should consider the incentives for innovation either on top of the feed-in tariff pricing or through some complementary policies to foster the deployment and the development of new technologies that will be needed in the future and reduce costs. Regarding taxes, recycling mechanisms, this is key. It's very important, the role of compensatory non-environmental exemption in carbon pricing schemes, for example. We have seen that with the Gilets jaunes. The Gilets jaunes, it was a movement as a result of this increase in taxes. And there was not a good way of communicating that this was not an increase in taxes only, but there could be these recycling mechanisms that allows people to be in the same level or pay the same level of taxes. And it was just moving the object of the tax from one non-green, let's say, element to another green element. And the last part, but not least, would be R&D investment, public investments in the form of R&D grants, but also government procurement. There is a lot of emerging literature indicating that the design of R&D funding schemes that can help foster growth, firm growth, above and beyond the innovation outcomes. So R&D investments represent an opportunity for economic growth, while economies replace and develop new infrastructure. Government R&D funding programs targeting small companies and those in early stages tend to be good in attracting other funding resources and advance small field competitiveness. And there is no, what we see is that there is no crowding out effects. So just to finish, some takeaways. So there is a steady advance in nationally determined contributions and some efforts in setting the targets, but we need additional efforts to reach those targets, those goals, and a clear definition of the policies and the roadmaps. Carbon emission or a price on carbon is necessary, but it's not the only policy. There are many other measures that needs to be put in place in order to reduce the barriers for investment, for example, in new technologies. So we need to be a little bit more open to the idea of not having only a carbon price, but some other type of policies. The policy success depends on the design elements more than the policy itself. And there is no one-fits-all approach solution. For each country, for each sector, it's very, very specific. So just to finish, the picture I gave, it was a little bit negative, but not. Well-designed policy instrument can help actually government to reach a triple agenda, reconciling not only environmental sustainability, but helping people in the current context of crisis or exiting a crisis to reduce inequalities and increase competitiveness. So there is room for that. If you are interested in clicking in the decarbonization policy tool, here it is. I can leave the link later on if you are interested in the chat. And thank you very much. If you have any question, I'm very happy to answer. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Christina. That was an excellent presentation, really interesting. To everyone in the audience, I would ask you please to put your questions in the chat. I see there's already a question there. If anyone has any other questions, please add them in the chat or raise your hand. So let's start with Lata's question, who's asking, what is the reason for lack of data in Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, etc.? Is it a lack of policy instruments themselves or an inability to measure the impact of policies?
That's a very good question. I would like to have an answer. We did a review in a very systematic way, introducing different search strings and so on, and this is what we get. Generally speaking, data in developing countries is not available to the extent that is available in developed countries. If this is political will, I'm not completely sure, but it is true that there is less research focusing in these areas and a lot of not knowns kind of things, and it can be a mix of everything, but mostly it's because there is not original data coming from those countries that we can rely on, so there is less available actual research on that field.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, please do put them in the chat or raise your hand. I had another question in the meantime. I mean, this has obviously been a very big week for new policies coming out in the UK itself, Christina. So we've had the net zero review, net zero strategy, sorry, come out yesterday and everything else. So I'm kind of keen to get your thoughts on that and things like, for example, from the heat and building strategy, the 5K grants for people to put heat pumps in their houses. Is that an effective policy in your opinion?
It's not going to work. In my opinion, it's not going to work. This is what evidence has told us. I am currently working on a different project in energy efficiency myself. And what we see is that former programs that only target households with this type of subsidies are not effective because there are many barriers related to behavior that we are not tackling with that. So unless we put in place other type of soft instruments, information, and we integrate everything in a more systemic way, this 5,000 pounds just to change the boilers by heat pumps is I don't think it's going to work. This is what the evidence has said in previous schemes, unfortunately.
Right. Unfortunately, yeah. And I mean, so going into COP26, then what would you be looking to see, kind of the signals you'd be looking to see at COP26 to make these things improve? Sorry, can you repeat, Eric? Sorry, I was just asking, going into COP26 in a week, what kind of signals are you looking for to come out of, to kind of improve these kind of policies? Well, I mean, I think we need more clarity on the roadmaps themselves. We have the targets. We know that they are not enough. And I think one of the most important things will be related to the Article 6 and who pays for what. And the 100 billion pounds, $billion per year that developed countries have to put in the Climate Green Fund for making the difference. And these are the most controversial points right now. So I really hope there is actual discussion on this, and there are new compromises by developed countries in order to make effective this money and technology transfer and all that. Otherwise, it will be complicated. Right. Yeah. Thank you. One more quick question. I think we've just had a question come in from Siju, who's asking, could you please elaborate on the lack of carbon price signals? I mean, there are many countries right now with carbon pricing schemes, and the carbon price set the signal that we have to change the consumption and move the consumption from activities that are more emitting to some others that are not, in terms of, well, that is econ basically, and putting a price on externalities.
So that is needed, but there is many things that we cannot tackle with that. As I mentioned before, it's the same with the behavioral measures in the energy efficiency sector. We are not going to tackle that with a carbon price. So we really need other instruments on top of this carbon price in order to balance these trade-offs and not make, because it's very easy just to put a carbon price and who will pay for that? Most of the times companies are able to pass through the cost to consumers, and it's the more vulnerable consumer, the one that is going to have to pay for this tax, and are the ones that are less able to do it. So we need other type of policies, other type of instruments to compensate this. And there is when we have the role of, for example, government procurement that can send a signal about in local communities on where to invest, how to invest, and all this. So the carbon price is needed, but by itself, as a standalone policy, is not going to make a change.
Okay, thank you. And I just saw Abdul Hamid that you've raised your hand. If you want to ask one very quick question before we move on to our next speaker, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Christina, for the presentation. So my question is, how do we continue to monitor the pathways by which the policies are developed, especially because policies can be specific to each sector? So how do we ensure that we keep monitoring and enhancing the pathways and the roadmap that we have towards achieving those targets?
I think monitoring is something essential, because otherwise there won't be a way to basically be sure that we are on the right pathway, and there is not accountability. So that's why many of the issues now with targets as well is how to translate. And I talk a lot about policy, how to translate those targets, sectoral or whatever, into law, because that's the only way to make the agents accountable in the future. So I think we need to, yes, monitor this and make the agents involved in the processes of decarbonization accountable if they are not reaching the proposed goals.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina. And it's great to have lots of questions there. We're going to have to move on to our next speaker now in the interest of time. So our next speaker is Dr. Markus Gehring, who is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law and also Director of the Center for European Legal Studies and a Fellow of the Lauterpacht Center for International Law. So Markus, over to you, please, and go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Eric. And I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay. And
yeah, it's coming up for us. Okay,
perfect.
There we go.
And of course, I need the chat out. So thank you very much to the organizers, to Cambridge Zero, for the amazing work you do. This is research that we've done in the law faculty and with partners that I'm presenting. So we started with the domestic policies with Christina, and now we're moving on to how do actually states sort of safeguard these policies when they're interacting with other states. And the special focus here is international trade. So how do states not undermine the hard-won achievements in carbon reductions that they're doing at home by just exporting or leaking the carbon to other countries, was sort of our question. And what is the newest research on this? What are states actually doing in their context, and not just states, but also the European Union, which is sort of part of what we're researching. I'm starting with a few basics. In my view, Christina is absolutely right when she says, look, you can't just look at the environmental outcome. You also need to look at the social and the economic dimension. And that's very much the approach we took. If you translate that to the to international trade and investment, you will find that trade and environment don't have a black and white relationship. It's rather a shade of gray, right? Some trade is really good for climate related outcomes. Other trade is maybe not so good. So the question, the design question, as it were, and I apologize, as a lawyer, my slides are full of text and don't have very good graphs. But the design question is here, how can we design trade rules that actually support the good trade in climate and reduce the negative trade in climate? So ideally, trade and investment law will foster, not frustrate, the transition to a low carbon economy. That was already found in policy documents such as Agenda 21, which I would recommend if you're interested in this field. Look at the trade and environment chapter in Agenda 21, and then also the 1994 ISD Winnipeg principles. There was a relatively large study done on the sort of legal foundations of trade and climate change by the WTO and the UN Environment Programme in 2009. And they raised a lot of questions. So, for example, the general exceptions norm, Article 20 GATT, might not be sufficient to capture all the all the climate measures that a WTO member state wants to adopt. But they didn't provide a lot of answers. And that's where the role of researchers comes in. In my view, current trade and investment law hinders, permits, and supports climate measures. That's a citation from Marie-Claire Cordonier-Seger's most recent book, Athena's Treaties, where she really analyzes what exactly are the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of new trade rules, regional trade rules. And these are not just sort of theoretical questions. The first disputes between states have started. So countries are adopting measures that other countries complain about not being compatible with their international trade obligations. So, for example, Canada feed-in tariffs, or China measures of wind power, two disputes in the World Trade Organization. And if you're interested in this, then there's more research that we did on the legal transition to the green economy. Now, trade and climate change. Trade law started historically with a starting point of clinical isolation. So in many ways, trade lawyers said no other aspect is important, only the trade obligations are important. And that only changed in 1996, when in the Gehring case, the WTO sort of opened it up and specifically rejected the notion that somehow trade law lives in clinical isolation from other areas of international law. But the sentiment, and I look at all of us sort of climate-minded people, unfortunately, the sentiment continues to this day on both sides of the equation. So trade lawyers don't like to talk about climate change, and climate experts don't like to talk about international trade or international trade law, right? The sentiment was expressed by the Australian government when they were criticized for not allowing further climate measures in their UK-Australia FTA. And the Australian government said, we didn't negotiate a climate treaty, we just negotiated a trade treaty. That is very short-sighted. And you see my comment here. I think climate change is perhaps the most important trade issue of our time. My publisher always says, promote your books, so I've done that. But what are the trends? So we've reviewed about 2,000 available free trade agreements in the world, and not all of them actually even contain provisions on environment or on climate change specifically. Many were drafted long before the sort of insight that trade law is not a world unto itself. So if we just focus on the most recent free trade agreements, we can identify two trends. There are commitments ensuring that domestic laws provide high level of environmental protection. And here you have the example from the Canada-EU CETA agreement, and non-regression clauses for trade investment. so that the parties don't waive or otherwise derogate from the level of climate protection or environmental protection that they have in the interest of trade. For example, in the Korea and New Zealand agreement. We did a fairly large study, which we published with the Commonwealth Secretariat. If you're interested in it, it has a several hundred-page annex where we really specify which provisions we looked at. Now, if we then shift gears and say, what else can be done for trade and climate change so that it doesn't hinder? And so we can find new mechanisms for cooperation on climate change. We can enhance trade in climate-friendly goods and services, including directly to encourage clean development. And this was part of the think piece that we wrote for legal options for the post-Brexit climate change and any energy provisions between the UK and the EU in 2019. But to be fair, the UK and the EU went much further. And that's where the good news lies, because in the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, we have a high watermark in terms of provisions that take climate change seriously. I will skip these slides in the interest of time. There are other sort of agreements, most notably EU-Japan, which for the first time don't just mention the Paris Agreement, but also commit the parties to fully implement the Paris Agreement. And that is helpful in trade relations, because if you're adopting a measure like the measures that Christina outlined in her study, and another country says, well, you know, this is really not in line with non-discrimination provisions, well, then having a provision which allows you to explain how your measure really implements the Paris Agreement and the national determined contributions thereunder can be really helpful. It doesn't necessarily justify the measure, but it changes, in our view, the terms of the debate. And this is very different to, for example, the US approach. The US approach only allows trade measures of under multilateral environmental agreements and only for the countries that have ratified them. They affirm the commitment to implement these multilateral agreements and want to sort of cooperate, but they don't give a kind of carve out or exception when it comes to climate provisions to the trading partners under the USMCA of 2018, for example. Climate change is not really specifically mentioned. Rather, they talk about air pollution or other challenges in that regard. I already highlighted that in our research, we found that the high watermark is really the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Why is this the latest in the evolution of trade and climate change provision? Because it's the first time that that climate change and climate protection at the domestic level becomes an essential element of a trading relationship. So if the UK or the EU would walk away from climate targets, would walk away from climate change provisions, under those conditions, the trade relationship would fall. It would authorize the other side to impose trade measures or even to walk away from an international trade agreement. No other trade agreement contains provisions of this nature, right? So Article 764 says it's an essential element of the partnership established by the TCA, as well as any supplementing agreement. So any agreement between the UK and the EU also has to comply with this essential climate change being an essential element. And yeah, here we have more commentary on the TCA. It also contains a climate level of protection. which actually contains commitments that the UK has undertaken up to 2030. So there are specific reduction commitments in a trade agreement, which is an international first. Of course, they could have been more ambitious because they're only committing to a 40% economy-wide target by 2030. That's below the current national determined contribution by the UK, but nonetheless, it's part of a trade agreement and therefore, in my view, should be welcomed. And of course, both sides, the UK and the EU, commit to carbon pricing and having an effective system of carbon pricing in place, supervised by an independent Office for Environmental Protection. The latest iteration in the last 30 seconds is border tax adjustment or border carbon. These are unilateral trade measures, and for the first time, a trading bloc, namely the European Union, has proposed to adopt these unilateral trade measures in the form of the Border Carbon Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. We don't have time this afternoon to fully explain what CBAM is, but the Commission is proposing to apply this mechanism to imports of cement, iron, steel, aluminium, fertilizers, and electricity. The trader would have to surrender CBAM certificates that represent the tons of carbon embedded in these products, and they would have to purchase these certificates on a market that is linked to the EU ETS. I think most will be familiar with the EU ETS. If you want to learn more about this, join our many events next week. So the research center that I'm directing is having a discussion about CBAM at 1 p.m. on Wednesday. And then we are organizing a fairly large conference also with the Bennett Institute and Cambridge Zero on climate change, the SDGs, and the law, which starts at 1 p.m. on Friday next week on the 29th of October. And with that, I leave you with some concluding thoughts. I think transition to the green economy with benefits in the fight against poverty is generally manageable without raising trade or investment concerns, just like environmental objectives can be achieved in other areas. While some trade rules could pose limits on climate change policies, if carefully crafted, they do neither give rise to trade law concerns or can be defended on the basis of their public policy objectives. And I would include the way the EU has designed CBAM in that category. There is room for improvement, and we're seeing countries agreeing these improvements in regional trade agreement. But you will forgive the academic in me if I say that further research is necessary. Thank you very much, Eric, and sorry for going slightly over time.
It's okay. Thank you very much for the really interesting and excellent presentation, Markus. And as we've got time for some questions, so please, to the audience, please do put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. I see we've already got a question from Lata here, who's asking, are new additions to TCAs adopted later by other nations? And can the UK, EU be a global leader in this area? Are TCAs and trade models subject to trends that can be followed when new clauses are introduced, or do they depend strongly on the national economy, national industries, and public attitudes?
Well, in an ideal world, they would be tailor-made to the specific country in question. Research by our former Cambridge colleague and now professor in the University of Vienna, Michael Weibel, has shown that countries use boilerplate text. So they copy from agreements that they have already themselves agreed or that other countries have agreed. And so there's a replication effect of very, very progressive trade provisions. That's why, in a way, urging your own government to be very progressive on trade can be important, not just for your own country, but can be important for other countries as well. because this text then is multiplied, hopefully is transferred into other agreements. Now, the UK at the moment is not doing that because they're so desperate to agree lots of trade agreements to show how wonderful Brexit is, that they're not really using the text that they had agreed in the TCA in any other relationship. We hear, however, that, for example, the New Zealand-UK relationship has very progressive language, some of which is similar to the language that the UK agreed with the EU on material breach, for example. And that would be a huge step forward, because suddenly it's not just the EU imposing somewhat strict measures on a former member. Here we would have two sovereign countries that care deeply, and Natalie Jones can maybe tell us more about it, care deeply about climate change, coming together and agreeing this in an international trade agreement, which would be hugely progressive. I would argue that if you measured all current bilateral or regional trade agreements under negotiation, the TCA climate provisions are the high water mark. There is no other agreement that has such stringent measures. I mean, the EU tried to put something similar into the CAI, the China investment agreement, by saying we are making the Paris Agreement binding between the parties, and we are making the NDCs binding under the investment agreement. That's an interesting step forward. That is maybe something that could be quite palatable to other parts of the world not related to the European Union.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Natalie, actually. Mark, who's asking, what do you think are the biggest opportunities in the coming months for advancement on this agenda?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question. So part of me is hoping for a big breakthrough on Article 6 in general, and Article 6.4, the Sustainable Development Mechanism in particular, because if we had some form of, dare I say, global carbon pricing, maybe some of the sort of unilateral measures that the EU is currently contemplating wouldn't be necessary to the same extent. I think in general, greater understanding on both sides of the equation among the trade lawyers, but also the climate lawyers would be really welcome, right? This is an ideal year for this, because we have the big COP, the 5-year COP coming up in Glasgow, and then a month later we have MC12, the ministerial conference, the 12th ministerial conference of the World Trade Organization coming up in Geneva. And there will be a big statement on sustainable development, on environmental protection, hopefully also including some language on how countries really have to make climate change the objective of their trade and economic policies, but we'll need to wait and see.
Great, yeah, watch this space and exciting months ahead. I think we're, in the interest of time, we're going to have to, oh, sorry, I just saw one question come in. Let's do this question quickly before we move on. From Christiana asking, do you think that making the NDCs binding under the investment agreements could be also a step to make them binding in general before the international courts?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Christiana, Professor Durrani. I would love to see that. Unfortunately, in your own region, in the EU-Mercosur agreement, we've seen text that falls far short of A, taking climate change seriously, B, making the NDCs of both sides binding in any shape or form, right? I think part of the reason why the draft text hasn't been advanced for the last 3 years is not just the administration in Brazil, but is also to do with the lack of ambition in the reform text of the EU-Mercosur agreement. And so, yes, if we could get better language for our trade agreements, we can then also submit some of these disputes to, for example, the World Trade Organization or an ad hoc trade panel and get the right outcome. Because at the moment, the legal framework is not really conducive to safeguarding climate measures, we have to justify these climate measures, which always puts us on the back foot in a dispute situation. And that is not a comfortable place for climate measures to be.
Okay, thank you very much, Markus, for answering all those questions and for the presentation. We're going to have to move on to our next speaker now, in the interest of time. So our next speaker is Dr. Sarabi Ranganathan, who is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law as well, and she's Co-Acting Director of the Lauterpacht Center for International Law. So Sarabi, please share your screen and over to you. I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, sorry. This one would think we would stop doing this, but this always happens. So thanks very much, Eric.
And can you put your screen on slideshow, please, as well?
It is on slideshow, isn't it?
As in just presentation mode, I mean, yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much for the invitation and to all of you who are joining today. Now, I'm very conscious that I'm here as an oceanic interloper in what is a climate change conversation. Of course, we know the two are not unconnected. The ocean is a major regulator of the global climate and is also directly implicated in many of the fixes or solutions that are being promoted for climate change, including, for example, the move to renewables, which has direct consequences for seabed mining, or suggestions around the use of biotechnology, which has direct consequences for treaties that are currently under negotiation at the UN on marine genetic resources. But given that these two, and Markus talked a little bit about this, given that there is very little or very restricted interpenetration between the discussions in oceanic contexts and climatic contexts, I thought what I'd do today is not talk so much about the specifics of the particular regimes I work on, but take a step back and tell you in broad terms what my research does, which is that it examines how current challenges confronting the ocean are recognized in existing governance regimes and thinks about the directions in which these should go. The provocation that my research offers is that we have to recognize that many of the problems that confront the ocean today are not about an absence of the law, nor are they necessarily about enacting small fixes to existing legal regimes, although a lot of the action at the moment is around these fixes in, again, seabed mining or biodiversity governance and so forth. They are really about the goals that legal regimes that already exist have promoted and continue to promote in the face of increasing climatic disaster and oceanic imperilment. So in short, the ocean is imperiled, but it is not a lawless space, although this second fact is often less recognized. So to situate my claims, let me just begin with a few maps. Now, the first map that you see here is a map of this is hosted on the UN webpage on decolonization, and it purports to represent the world as it existed in 1945, which the UN contrasts with the world as it is today. Taken together, the two maps present a picture of change, a move from empires to states, but have a look at how they represent the ocean itself. The ocean remains parchment yellow in 1945, parchment yellow today, with no sense of any change or transition taking place reflected in, outside of land territory. So again, the sense of change is visually dramatic so far as land is concerned and almost absent in the seas. This is not an isolated example. The UN is simply following an old map-making tradition. You see another example of this, for example, in this very standard National Geographic map, which most of us encounter in high school or in university. And again, you have textured, featureful land, but an empty sea. It is as if all political change or all texture stops at the boundary, stops at the coast. Now, we know this is not true. So I'm going to show you a bunch of slightly more accurate maps that give you a sense of the ways in which the ocean has been impacted by the changes that have taken place in global ordering since 1945. These are maps of the increasing legal lines that have been drawn in the ocean and the increasing extent of jurisdictional expansion that has taken place in seaward directions. So here's the first map. Now, this is actually a more accurate map of political boundaries in the ocean, because here you see quite a lot of the sea is already enclosed within national jurisdiction. Only the light gray areas that you see on these maps remain, so to speak, the high seas. The rest are within some form or the other of national jurisdiction, either enclosed as territorial seas or as exclusive economic zones of states or as continental shelves and outer continental shelves. This is the same map, but in a Pacific exposure, so you can also see how much of the Pacific Ocean is enclosed within national jurisdiction. Here then is a map of seabed mining concessions. So states and corporations have been given contracts to explore the ocean floor for possible commercial recovery of seabed minerals. And you can see how, again, the spread of these concessions is actually quite prominent in the Pacific Ocean, but also exists in the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. This is a map of areas that are enclosed within various regional fisheries management organizations or demarcated as marine protected areas. So again, a map of fishing in the oceans. And again, the sense that there are narrow zones that are enclosed under national jurisdiction, and a broad high seas starts disappearing once you look at this map. Bring them all together and you begin to sense what a crowded ocean it really is, as opposed to the empty depictions we saw a little while ago. And this is not the end of it. Let me show you a few more maps. So here is a map of submarine cables that connect we know that submarine cables are basically what account for 99% of global communications. The reason we are talking now is because a cable is carrying the traffic back and forth. A lot of communication, online communication, is not satellite communication as is often supposed, but really beholden to these cables. Another map of another set of arteries of globalization. This is a map of shipping routes. And to give you an example, just to give you an idea of the density of international shipping, here is a map that was plotted that marks real-time existence of various ships in the seas. And again, we know this. We saw what happened when the Ever Given was stuck for 2 days in the Suez Canal, what a traffic jam that led to, and how that played with our idea of this vast, empty, remote, inexhaustible ocean on which human beings could mark but few traces. This is another interesting map. This is a map that plots the amount of plastic in the ocean with every little white dot marking 20 kilograms of plastic. You can see how dense the concentration of plastic is in some areas, so much so that it seems almost to be compacting itself into the solidity of landfills, right? And this is the fear of this kind of plastic compacting has led to a lot of campaigns around oceanic plastics, including a cheeky one from a few years ago, where Sir David Attenborough, Al Gore, and a bunch of other, together with the Plastic Foundations and Land Bible, came together to announce a claim for statehood for new islands that were emerging out of trash. So they suggested that trash islands could become very well their own country, with therefore responsibility for their own cleanup and not causing environmental consequences for other countries. It was, of course, tongue in cheek. This is not how states are created in international law, but it was meant to bring traction on the absurdity of the plastic problem in the oceans. So again, if I just bring all of what we've seen together, this is what a crowded ocean looks like, replacing these ideas of the empty and inexhaustible seas that have dogged our imaginaries and continue to sort of underpin the legal regimes that exist for the oceans. All right, so the ocean, in short, is crowded. It's crowded in terms of activities, it's crowded in terms of users, but also, as I've tried to show just through these maps, with a number of jurisdictional lines and legal regimes that actually license and enable all of these activities that we see that are extractive activities. They have a deleterious effect on oceanic ecologies and marine life, but also lives of human communities that are implicated in these oceanic ecologies. So what does my research do? Now, I examined this crowding of the ocean and the ways in which the ocean was transformed as a political, legal, ecological, and economic space over the course of the 20th century. Part of this research, part of the motivation for this research comes, of course, from an interest in the history of international ordering and the history of international law. But a lot of it is motivated by current developments that are seeking to define the ocean's future. These developments include new lawmaking initiatives that sort of build on existing regimes that seek to unlock further the so-called blue economy, as also they hope to arrest the decline of oceanic ecosystems. They include, for example, work on a seabed mining code, which will enable commercial recovery of operations to begin. So already oceanic exploration for the purposes of eventual seabed mining has begun under the provisions of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The mining code will then allow companies to advance to the next stage, which is to actually begin the commercial recovery. There is also ongoing what is called the BBNJ process, which is negotiations on a new global ocean treaty, which will, on the one hand, create a framework for the access and use of marine biodiversity, marine genetic resources, and on the other hand, might, it is hoped, enact some measures to protect the dying ocean. Some of the other things include new techno-utopian experiments like the seasteading projects of Silicon Valley venture capitalists, which seek to imagine new forms of living with and on the sea, including with and on the sea in the event of rising waters, disappearing land, and therefore present a kind of techno-fix to problems of climate change. My two interests come together because, of course, these new visions and these new lawmaking experiments build on and recycle older imaginaries of the vastness of the ocean, of the remoteness of the ocean, of the growth potential of oceanic resources, of the protean and unequal freedoms of the ocean. The new developments are also constrained. So here you see pictures of older lawmaking exercises. The law of the sea has been a subject of international negotiation for the past 70 years and at vast scale. The new developments, of course, are also constrained by the ways in which past developments have given shape to the ocean in the present. We know that legal change, and the two previous presentations have described this legal change, does not take place in a vacuum. It takes place against the background of already congealed legal regimes and also already congealed ideas, legal and economic ideas of the law itself and of what is necessary for the law to do. So for example, ideas of competitiveness, ideas of extraction, ideas of growth, these remain part of the sort of axiomatic assumptions in the context of which legal change today is discussed. And the ocean has been interesting because it has always been a site for projections, a sort of a site where projections of the future or imaginations of the future have been worked out and is continuing to be so. My work therefore looks at the ways in which those past projections of oceanic futures, projections including, again, visions of this massive blue economy, have brought us to the ocean of today. So in short, I think there are two distinctive ways in which we might think about the ocean and international law today. Firstly, recognizing, and in other work and in other talks, I describe this more fully, but recognizing that the ocean itself is legally constructed. This is not to say, of course, that there is not a physical ocean or a biological ocean. Of course, there is, but the ways in which this ocean is understood, the ways in which it's encountered, is entirely shaped by existing international law and existing legal regimes, which includes mostly legal regimes that are tilted towards maximizing the extraction of different oceanic resources. The law reifies certain political geographies of the ocean, as well as environmental and economic imaginaries, and the existing opportunities for engaging with the ocean. So here it is actually great fun to engage with the history of lawmaking, because that also then reveals the universe of alternative possibilities that might have once existed and might have suggested different trajectories for the ocean, but sort of failed to materialize. So what kinds of oceans would we have had when assumptions, for example, of competition or of multiplicity or anti-monopoly provisions had not been enacted, or without the actually putting the sort of consolidation in place of a seabed mining regime. Secondly, if the ocean is legally constructed, it's also worth thinking about the ways in which international law has had an oceanic context for a very long time. So there is a way in which we view international law today and what is given and what is not given. We have particular understandings of international legal doctrines, international legal processes, international legal sources, and what counts as international legal expertise. And a lot of my work traces how these acquire their specific present form through the construction of oceanic regimes. So if the ocean is legally constructed, there is also the oceanic construction and congealment of legal imaginaries, which continue to shape how we think about future prospects of the ocean. And really, to understand my final point, and I'm going to finish very quickly, is just to say that the ocean remains a major site of international law auditing, but it's a vastly understudied site. You find very few mentions of the ocean in histories of international law or in even present discussions. Again, climate change is a good example, but many other environmental law as well, where the ocean remains to some extent on the margins of a lot of discourse. And I think, and my suggestion would be that to understand what are the possibilities of the future that can or will be realized through international law, as also to understand what are the future possibilities that can and will be realized for the ocean, it's important to try to start bringing together these different regimes that have been hermetically sealed off from each other. And so we come back to the imagination, the project, trying to understand how both legal imaginaries and ocean imaginaries are constructed, but also I would say co-constructed. And this is, of course, important as we debate the possible futures we're looking at. On the one hand, we have representations. This is a corporate representation from Japan of an idea of a future marine city, the first picture you're looking at. The other picture you're looking at is the all too dismal reality of the future we're headed towards, which is, again, of plastic and dying biodiversity of the oceans. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sarabi. That was really interesting presentation, and great to see those maps of different representations of the ocean. So we've got a few questions here in the chat already. I'll start with Lata's question, who's asking, how do you predict that oceanic jurisdictions might change as we approach net zero? For example, as fishing, fossil fuels, mining, etc., take less importance compared to offshore wind, marine ecosystem protection, desalination, etc.
And I think there's also an addition to add fossil fuels and mining to join fishing. So yeah, this is a really good question, right? One of the problems, and this is a standard problem of the law of the sea, is that oceanic jurisdictions were created without very much thought given to the actual existing ecologies of the ocean, and very much on a very, very abstract representation of the possible interests that would be in the ocean. So what we see happening right now is that and this is true of a number of processes that are currently sort of taking place in order to, so to speak, update the existing law of the sea. They are taking place with the understanding that existing ocean regimes and ocean zones are problematic. They don't respond to real concerns, nor do they respond to the reality of ocean ecologies. But most of these processes take place under the injunction that they cannot undermine the existing law that exists. And not undermining that existing law also means keeping intact the zonal divisions. And these include, by the way, not just horizontal zones, but what is most interesting, vertical zones. So the separation of the water column from the ocean floor is legally encoded, as also is the definition given to various ocean resources, which are legally classified as either lying in the water or lying on the seabed, even though they might, the reality of the lives of these things or the interconnections may be otherwise. So in legal terms, change that actually responds to the reality of the dangers or the uses of the ocean is a fraught process. And I don't see much change happening in the short term. The one place where the change might come through, and this is what makes the process so fraught, is that the ongoing UN negotiation on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction is being forced to articulate how the negotiators understand places in the ocean like hydrothermal vents, which can't be easily classified as land or water, and therefore complicate the existing divisions that exist, right? So that might lead to the emergence of new sui generis regimes, which but without actually upsetting the existing divisions. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you very much. That's fascinating. Another question here from Markus, who's asking, do you think that the freedom of the high seas is part of the problem for addressing the law of the seas, the freedom of the high seas in inverted commas? And would the interpretation of this old principle of customary law need to be changed?
So thanks, Markus. That's a good question. I just have a paper that's just come out in this book that Markus, Kiniemi, and Annabelle Brett have edited, which actually argues that we need to understand what we talk about when we talk about the freedom of the seas. And that to a large extent, the freedom of the seas as exists today is not the old protean freedom of the seas that was associated with 17th century imaginaries of the ocean. It's a very legally encoded freedom that was recovered from the grasp of, or recovered from efforts to articulate actually more ambitious regimes for ocean regulation and also for the redistribution of oceanic resources. So it's a very particular, it's not freedom in the sense that there is no law, it's freedom in the sense that certain rights have been vested in states and in corporate actors to be able to act as they do. So it's not, so yes, it's a legally determined freedom. It's not the Hardinian tragedy of the commons, it's actually a tragedy of the law that we're talking about.
Thank you, Surabhi. Lots of questions coming in now. We've got a question from Natalie asking, regarding the ways international law and the oceans have co-constructed each other, the salt water principle in the history of the law of self-determination came to mind. Do you think there are similar ways in which currently the oceans or dominant ways of looking at the oceans are affecting how sovereignty and self-determination is realized?
I think that's a fascinating question, Natalie. And one answer would be yes. If you look at the number of claims for self-determination and for emergence as independent sort of polities that exist around the world, and the bases on which many of those claims are denied, where those polities are not regarded as self-determination units, partly on the account that they have not been colonized under the sort of blue water or salt water principle, right? They are actually parts of existing post-colonial states. Then you already see that imaginary continues to do background work, right? So you think about, just for example, to name just one situation, this is the kind of argument that it would be used in South Asia, in Kashmir, for example, to say that this is not a self-determination unit because it's part of a post-colonial state. But that then begs the question about why we think of self-determination only in terms of the blue water principle. But this is also a really interesting question historically, because there are great precedents. As I was reading a paper the other day, where Australia used, when it was in the early 20th century, it sort of had to change its deportation policy because it was not allowed to send people off to distant islands that across the water. So it reclassified islands that were about 20 miles out as essentially continuations of Australian territory, right? So by legal fiction disappearing the fact of the water that separated the mainland from these islands. So this sense of where is blue water and where it disappears is also legally constructed or politically constructed.
Thank you. This is a really fascinating topic. One very quick final question from Christopher, and then we're going to have to move on because we're running behind time a little bit. But what are some of the most promising approaches to reform our legal imaginaries of the high seas? Do you see UNCLOS, which I don't know what that is, but as the appropriate framework to inject an element of sustainability? And if it is fundamentally geared towards exploitation, where could possible alternatives lie?
So the UNCLOS is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is also popularly called the Constitution of the Oceans. It's, on the one hand, an absolutely fascinating treaty. It's a huge document. It took years to negotiate with the participation of more than 5,000 people, more than 150 states. So it is a document that, Law of the Sea scholars tend to revere, and it is worth sort of taking very seriously. But the UNCLOS, for all of its constitutional promise, is also part of the problem, because a lot of the things I'm describing to you, a lot of the oceanic divisions and the consolidation of the extractive imaginary has taken place through the UNCLOS. So I would suggest that if the promise of the UNCLOS lies in that argument that it represents a constitution, right? So there is a constitutional promise of being able to articulate sort of the interests in and rights in the sea, and sort of values of distribution, values of fairness, and so on. The UNCLOS, and this is a timely question because the UK Parliament is now conducting an inquiry into the ways in which the UNCLOS might need to be updated in present times. The response would have to be that actually to respect the constitutional promise of the UNCLOS, we have to unmake the idea of the sea that had been sort of made in the 1970s. That was a very, very specific imaginary which responded to the science of the time and the interests of the time and the understandings of the sea of the time. But we know that all of those understandings have been falling out of date for quite a long time. So promising approaches to reform the legal imaginaries may not lie so much in lawmaking contexts that are forced to work on the principles of the UNCLOS, are asked not to undermine the UNCLOS, but in a number of venues outside, which are actually pushing for radical reimagining of the possibilities of the sea outside of the sort of state-led multilateral fora.
Thank you very much, Surabhi. And this is a really fascinating topic and lots of really interesting questions there. Sadly, we're going to have to move on in the interest of time. I don't want to stop the discussion, but our next speaker is up now. So I'd like to introduce Professor Cristiane Derani, who's Professor of International Economic and Environmental Law at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Brazil, and also a fellow here in Cambridge at the Centre for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governments, as well as a steering committee member for the Cambridge Global Food Security. So over to you, Professor Durrani.
Hi, Eric. Hi, thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate for this initiative organizing this Cambridge Zero Research Symposium. And I'm very happy to be here sharing a little bit of my research. And so it is just in the good time after Surabhi, giving us this awful big picture about the sea and what's happening to it. So I'll take one of the principal elements that cause this awful scenario that she has just shown us. So the plastic waste throughout the global food system, we need to make a statement about that and to find a solution to go out of this increased production of plastic waste. So we have here the SDGs, and the SDG 2 that sets up the goal to end hunger, providing food security, nutrition, and sustainable agriculture until 2030. And the SDG 12 demands to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. So to couple all these two SDGs, I think is the big question we have, because when we talk about food production today, we necessarily talk about a global food system in a global value chain. And this way of production is leading us to the increase of the amount of plastic as package first. So here we can see the data from the UN. You can see the global material footprint, and you see that only between 2000 and 2017, the increase of 1 million plastic drinking bottle waters and 5 trillion single-use plastic bags. And here, attention, we are not talking about the single-use utensils, and we are using more and more, especially after the pandemic, and I will come after to this topic. Well, what is in fact a food system? A food system, I would say, is all about us, our lives, our environment, our behavior, is everything. Because food is this first and primary necessity of all society. So, and because of that, food system is a complex interrelation of people and nature, and since the beginning of our species. So it's not a novelty to say that we are in a food system. Everything we do every day is, so has somehow a relationship to this system. What does it mean? It means that if you want to change the way of we produce and consume food, our behavior and our entire society must be changed. And of course, it changes law and policy, because practically the entire society is involved in the system, and therefore change affects all social behavior. In this sense, the law has an importance, but has a limited role. And here, as you can see at the politics circle, you see the policy and legislation, political parties, taxes, subsidies, power relations, governance structures. So all these are related to the change of law, but also we have the change related to health care, to environment, to livelihoods, to education, to culture. Everything comes to regulation when you talk about changing our style of produce and consume food. Well, going further, when you talk about the change of a sustainable change towards a sustainable food system, we have to focus on the need of a sustainable value food chain. I will just come back just to see here in the middle, you have this, what we call food chain. The food chain is the core of a food system, and changing the food chain, we can spread this change throughout the food system. And what is all about? So we have here a definition of a sustainable value food chain by FAO, and you see that the full range of farms and firms and their successive coordinated value-adding activities that produce particular raw agricultural materials and transform them into particular food products that are sold to final consumers and disposed of after use in a manner that is profitable throughout, has broad-based benefits for society, and does not permanently deplete natural resources. And here is our big question: how to cope plastic waste and not harming or deplete natural resource? We must say it's impossible, because plastic is something that is permanent, and also is a toxic substance that is added to other natural resources like water, and even climate is affected by these toxic products that came from plastic waste. Well, so I work in a report. It's a very interesting report, as it was published in 2020. This a sustainable food system for the European Union, published by SAPER, and there we can find all these arguments, and also we draw possibly solution to go out from this permanent production of waste in our food system. So we call for a change from a linear farm to fork approach to a circular initiative. This is not new. So even the UNEP has evoked this necessity in 2010 in a report about a sustainable food supply chain. So to transform the supply chain into a sustainable value food chain, we need to reconsider the chain as a circular one, and not from farm to fork, but from another perspective, having a more sustainable and with less production of waste. Here we see that the conclusions of the report. So the current food system is unsustainable, requiring attention to its social, economic, and ecological components. The transition from take, make, consume, dispose chains towards sustainable and circular food system is highly dependent on the organizational and social innovation, and also that change on production and consumption pattern is necessary, and a transition out of mass consumption, because mass consumption also comes with a lot of package and a lot of single-use utensils. Well, I'm sorry. Then we can see the dilemma of packaging. And we see that in 2014, alone 25.8 million tons of post-consumer plastic was generated in Europe, of which food packaging has a major share. Food packaging is, however, important for food preservation and to and to reduce it is a challenge. There has been a focus on developing more sustainable packaging with particular attention on biodegradable materials. Reducing the distance from producers to consumers and changing habits of fast food and take and go are also important. The EU gave a step forward, and in 2019 approved a directive which banned some kind of plastics. So from the 3rd of July 2021, single-use plastic plates, cutlery, straws, balloon sticks, and cotton buds cannot be placed on the markets of the EU member states. In addition, the same measure applies to cups, food and beverage containers made of expanded polystyrene and all products made of oxo-degradable plastic. Under the new rules, certain throwaway plastic products for which alternative exists are simply banned. More than 80% of marine litter is plastic. Plastic accumulates in seas, oceans, and on the beaches in the EU and worldwide. Plastic residues are found in marine species such as sea turtles, seals, whales, and birds, but also in fish and shellfish, and therefore in the human food chain. This is a very important directive, and I think and I hope it inspires national legislation all over the world. Well, today we have still a worse situation. The COVID-19 will almost double acute hunger by the end of 2020. So the COVID-19 pandemic will see more than 250 million people suffering acute hunger by the end of the year, according to new figures from the World Food Programme. Latest numbers indicated the lives and livelihoods of 265 million people in low and middle income countries will be under severe threat unless swift action is taken to tackle the pandemic up from a current 135 million. That is nearly double the number in the newly published Global Report on Food Crisis 2020, which estimates that 135 million people in 55 countries currently face acute hunger as a result chiefly of a conflict affects climate change and economic crisis. Well, this is a problem brought by COVID-19, and not only this, with this we have the problem brought related to plastic. So the pandemic has forced society across the world to limit activities to those required to meet essential needs for shelter, food, and health, and also has increased the production of waste. The fight against COVID-19 generates risks for other contamination and disease. Therefore, it is important to adopt different procedures, materials, methods of production, and discharge. Seeing these problems in numbers, we have here this paper that's really scaring, because it shows the increase of plastic waste in such a few amount of months. So in 2019, we had the production of 400 million tons of plastic waste. However, the estimated waste volume reached over 530 million tons in the first 7 months of COVID-19 outbreak, suggesting that plastic waste totals for 2020 would be at least the double of 2019. Well, we know that part of this increase results from the public demand for disposable face masks and gloves, but the consumption of plastic packaging by takeaway services, e-commerce outlets, and express delivery industries increased extensively with social distance requirements. Takeaway and home delivery services generate additional 1.21 million tons of plastic waste from April to May 2020 during the lockdown in Singapore alone, says the paper. So if you understand that most of the takeaway in food has increased during the pandemic, we have this problem generated by the new style and new culture created by the COVID-19. Well, what is the solution proposed by law? Well, international law for a global sustainable food system is needed because we don't live in a system that is purely local. Food is produced globally, and we need a global framework to regulate the production of food in terms of packaging and also the production of single-use utensils that are produced by plastic. So I take the example of the Convention of Persistent Organic Pollutants, it's a POPs Convention or Stockholm Convention. Each part shall prohibit and take the legal and administrative measures necessary to eliminate the production of this kind of polluant or to restrict its production. I highlighted this this text because I want to show the verbs used in this international convention. It's not normal. It's not. We don't necessarily use such a mandatory regulation when you talk about international law, but this kind of problem, so evoke severe treatment, and it was done in 2001, and I'm convinced that we have to use the same structure to ban plastic before it is too late, as has been shown by Surabhi before me. Well, I'm convinced also that the same mandatory rules shall be used internationally to prohibit the use of plastic throughout the global food chain, also being aware that it exists adequate technology to replace plastic as package, so as single-use utensil. In fact, the plastic used for packaging and consuming food will be back in the next meal. Nations and peoples are interconnected in an environmentally harmful food system. Plastic as package and single-use utensils are destroying biodiversity and being consumed in seafood. There is a strong necessity to forbid single-use plastic and to develop policies stimulating different production and consumption patterns. As a global system, it is necessary to combine global, regional, and local legal and political actions. Also, legal change and efficient policies must be based on the best available technology and to be continuously updated, aiming at a sustainable food system, building equity, regenerating ecosystem, and reintegrating human activities within Earth limits. Concluding what law can do immediately. So I would say that food security is also about production, distribution, and consumption in a fair, equitable, and sustainable way throughout the planet. And it's a matter of law to find justice in the different actions we do. So law has an important task for that. And market is unable to induce plastic waste reduction in the food system. On the contrary, mass consumption of food is more profitable despite generating more packaging waste. Consumers have few choice. The reduction of plastic waste is rather a matter of production strategy and a food system change, which demands a strong mandatory rules and also compromise of the states and among states. Based on science and supported by technology innovation, law is able to readdress new patterns of production and consumption throughout the food system and to enhance a just and sustainable food value chain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christiana, for a really interesting and slightly scary talk as well. Could I just quickly, we'll have some time for a few questions quickly. So the first question here is from Markus asking, do you think the time has come to regulate plastics at the international level? And do we need a Minamata Convention for plastics?
Excuse me.
Did you hear that? Sorry, I can repeat the question. So
yeah, please, I was just taking a look here. I didn't finish.
So the question.
Do you think the time has come? Oh yeah. Oh, see. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I think we are running out of time, Markus. I think we need to regulate it in the international level, because I think we have to initiate it in the international level, since we have this global production of food. The food value chain is an international chain, and plastic also is very helpful to make this globalization of food. And if you want to ban plastic, we have to reorientate our plastic production, and also improving the alternatives, technological alternatives that already exist. Yeah, thank you very much for your question, Markus.
I mean, following on from that, another question here from Lato asking about the technological alternatives that exist. So, for example, biodegradable plastics, etc. But processing facilities for recycling these in traditional plastics always fall short. So how can this be addressed on a national, let alone international level? The use of these kind of technological alternatives, such as biodegradable plastics.
So history has shown to us that throughout capitalism, the technical change most of the time are imposed by policies. So competition don't necessarily lead to best available technology. So they lead to the cheapest technology. And here we have really to create a framework of policies in the national level, as well in the international level, to make this change happen. If you take, for example, the Montreal Protocol, so it had some kind of a similar architecture related to improving the technological change. And here we need this. So in both levels, international as well as in national level, the strong activity of states, subsidies, policies, and also mandatory rules forbidding some kinds of plastic, just as we did in the POPs Convention.
Okay, thank you very much, Christiana, for answering those questions and for your great talk. I'm going to ask, there's a few more questions for you in the chat, but I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind answering those written answers in the chat, because we're running a bit behind schedule, and I want to make sure we still have time to get through all the talks on our program. So if you wouldn't mind answering those questions in the chat, that would be great. Thank you. So our next speaker then is Dr. Christopher Campbell Duraflay, who's a Banting postdoctoral fellow working with Professor Jorge Vinuales here at Cambridge, and a fellow at the Center for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance. So Christiana, could I ask you to stop sharing your screen, and then Christopher can share his screen? No, sorry. And then we can hand over to Christopher for the next talk.
Yes, hello everyone. Let me share my screen. Is that working?
Yeah, that's great. Go for it.
How are you? Thanks for this opportunity to present an ongoing project on the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. Unlike previous talks that were fascinating, I'll focus on one country, but I hope the legislative process that I'll discuss in Canada can be useful to enrich similar initiatives that are ongoing around the world. It is well known that Canada has an ambivalent stance with regard to international climate law. It is quick to adhere to treaties such as the Kyoto Protocol or more recently the Paris Agreement, and yet it has a consistent record of failing to achieve the targets that it sets for itself. Canada failed to achieve its binding Kyoto Protocol target, its voluntary Copenhagen Accord target. Recently, in its revised NDC, its revised Paris target, it announced 40 to 45% reduction target by 2030, but current policies are not yet in line with achieving that target. In this context, the question arises, does the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, adopted this summer by Parliament, reverse the tendency? The primary goal of the Act is to implement the Paris Agreement. It sets a clear target of net zero by 2050 and calls on to the minister to set 5 years target, mirroring the procedural framework of the Paris Agreement, and it puts front and center the concept of government accountability. And the context for this potential reversal is one of failure to adopt climate laws. The Kyoto Protocol Act was repealed in 2012, and over the last decades, there were at least 4 private members' bill through which Parliament attempted to adopt a climate legislation in Canada and fail. So this research project asks, in this context, does the Net Zero Act succeed at bringing the Paris Agreement home? Specifically, what provisions does it domesticate in Canadian law? What provisions does it omit? And does it reinterpret the norms of the Paris Agreement following Auntie Weiner? Does it downsize or widen the language of the Paris Agreement? And for full disclosure, I'm a member of one of the organizations that was involved in the legislative process this summer, and I testified before the Canadian Senate on this matter. Let me focus for this presentation on 5 issues. One is the decarbonization timeframe of the Act. Like I mentioned, the Net Zero Act established 2050 as a clear timeline for decarbonization. It's actually 2050 or before, and that's a contrast with the ambiguity of the Paris target, where global emissions peaking is to happen sometime in the second half of the century. So the Net Zero Act is an example of a normative widening, if you will, in the sense that it reinterprets the Paris Agreement in a way that is more demanding. It shows how constructive ambiguity can work as states progressively converge toward a clear understanding of what a given treaty requires. Canada is not a leader in this. There were already a range of legislations that set 2050 as the target, including Norway, UK, New Zealand, Japan, and the EU in the wake of the IPCC's 2018 report. Second issue is that the Net Zero Act omits key principles that are applicable to target setting. The Paris Agreement contains a list of principles. They're called normative expectations in the sense that they're not binding, that apply to the NDC targets, the 5-year targets, such as progression, highest possible ambition of the targets, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, and a call on to states to explain how their targets are fair and ambitious in light of what other countries are doing. Bill C-12, as it was initially introduced before Parliament, takes a very minimalist approach to target setting. It called onto the minister to take into account best scientific information and Canada's international commitments. But you'll note that commitment excludes the non-binding norms that I have just mentioned. The legislative process succeeded in improving the Act a little. The final version includes the principle of progression. It also calls on to the Minister of the Environment to consider advice from its newly created advisory body, as well as Indigenous knowledge. However, the Act omits key principles that were agreed to in Paris and in principle supported by Canada, and that address the challenge of sharing mitigation efforts between countries in a way that would be effective and fair. A third issue is that the new Act also omits the obligation of conduct to take action towards targets. That's that appears in the Paris Agreement. Indeed, Article 4, parties are to pursue measures to achieve their voluntary targets. By contrast, the Net Zero Act calls onto the party, to the Minister of the Environment, so it is an obligation to establish a greenhouse emissions reduction plan. So an obligation to adopt a plan, but no obligation to pursue the target. And that raises really a red flag in terms of accountability. It doesn't show the kind of parliamentary intent that is necessary to allow judicial review by a court of the actions that are taken to pursue a target. Contrasts with the UK Climate Change Act, where it is the duty of the Secretary of State to respect the carbon budget. A fourth issue is what I would call the downsized approach to participation in the Net Zero Act. The Paris Agreement has an interestingly long and complete Article 12 that references climate education, training, public awareness, participation, access to information, concepts that are quite understandable and relevant in the context of something as momentous as the global transition towards a low carbon economy, really the transformation of everything we do. Bill C-12 started at the very bottom of the barrel with a call on to the minister to provide stakeholders an opportunity to make submissions. So a huge contrast with the Paris approach. The act was only slightly improved over the course of the summer when establishing a plan, not the target, just the plan to achieve the target. The minister must take into account the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which contains language regarding the right to consultation and consent of Indigenous peoples. Still, the process that is applicable to target setting is thin, and it offers limited potential to generate buy-in from the different sectors of society to achieve those 5-year targets and the ultimate 2050 target. And the fifth issue is the Act's limited approach to accountability. Following Mark Boven's, accountability can be described as a relationship, in this case, where government has to justify its actions, where those justifications are subject to assessments, and where consequences may be applied. In the Net Zero Act, accountability relies on two pillars. First, the Independent Commissioner of the Environment reports to Parliament every 5 years on the implementation of measures that are announced. Note that it doesn't provide feedback on or recommendations on the targets that were set to achieve net zero, but only on the implementation of measures. And second, in the case of failure to achieve a target, the consequence is that the minister must provide reasons and identify remedial actions in a public report. We can compare with other initiatives around the world. In the UK, the Climate Change Committee assesses progress on a yearly basis. And in New Zealand, a declaration may be sought by courts in the case, a declaration by the courts in the case where the government fails to achieve a target. The Paris Agreement itself contains no guidance for state parties on how to hold themselves accountable. They have discretion in this matter. However, scholars agree that the success of the agreement heavily depends on effective accountability at the national level. So in conclude, let me identify 3 points. First, the Net Zero Act is significantly better at domesticating the provisions of the Paris Agreement in Canadian law than the initial Bill C-12. A range of reasons could be identified, but one of them is that the government was and remains in a minority situation and had to negotiate with other parties in Parliament. In terms of substance, the Act takes what I would call a rather parochial view of the climate challenge, because Parliament has left out key Paris Agreement principles that apply to sharing the burden of the global decarbonization between states. Compared with the EU climate law, the 20 target must be set, giving consideration to the need to ensure just and socially fair transition for all. In New Zealand, the minister must have regard to the response to climate change taken by other parties to the Paris Agreement. And in terms of process, the Act falls short of the generally accepted definition of accountability, since neither the advisory body nor the Commission on the Environment are mandated to provide independent assessments of the 5-year targets that are put forward by the government. Likewise, assessment of progress towards the targets appears to be limited and appears to exclude judicial review. As a result, while the Act has brought home the procedural framework of the Paris Agreement, I would argue that it offers limited safeguards against Canada continuing to miss its targets in the future, and most importantly, missing the 2050 net zero one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christopher. That was really interesting, and thanks also for sticking perfectly to time. So we have some time for some questions. So please, to the members of the audience, if you have some questions for Christopher, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. And I see we've already got a question here from Markus, who's saying, given how closely the Canadian law, despite its downsizing, aligns with PA obligations, would you say that complaining about Canadian PA compliance would be futile?
Would I say, let me reflect on the question.
Yes. I must say, I don't know enough about the legal terminology to know what this question means.
Sorry, Eric,
myself.
Paris Agreement.
Ah, of course, right, sorry.
So I agree that the approach to compliance and accountability within the Paris Agreement is quite limited. It's facilitative. It's based on transparency. It's based on reporting. And for me, the most promising avenues to promote compliance within the Paris Agreement lie in the realm of peer-to-peer accountability. There are interesting avenues for question and answers between states to push themselves further. But nonetheless, I think it's agreed that it's a generally facilitative and very soft approach to compliance. And I think that this conclusion makes it all the more important that going into national legislations, we have a strong accountability at the domestic level, either that the NDCs, the targets themselves come into law, or that the democratic accountability processes that are established are robust, or that there's judicial oversight of the actions taken to achieve those targets. So I would agree in a sense that it's futile, or it doesn't make sense at this point to continue criticizing too much the approach to compliance that was adopted in Paris, but that we should definitely focus on what is done in climate laws in Canada, in the UK, and in other countries around the world to make sure that there is accountability at that level.
Thank you, Christopher. And of course, Markus, PA would be the Paris Agreement. Another question here from Murray Gold, who's saying, Canada is an oil and gas producer. Does the Canadian legislation address the just transition measures to protect Canadian workers affected by climate mitigation measures?
Excellent question. And really the reliance of Canada in terms of its GDP, it's almost 7% of the GDP that is attributable to oil and gas production. So the question of natural resources exploitation is key to understand past efforts to adopt this law and the context in which this one was adopted. It's surprising that in this Framework Act, there's no mention of a just transition. So it's to be hoped that in the preparation of the targets and of the plans to achieve the targets, the concern of a just transition and the concern of those who are economically vulnerable in the context of the transition are taken into account. And maybe that allows to connect again to my observation on participation. Those targets need to achieve a just transition, especially for the provinces that are more invested in the oil sands, like Alberta. And it would seem that heightened participation by workers and by those provinces and by those cities would be important to ensure buy-in by those regions.
Okay, thank you very much, Christopher, for a really interesting presentation and for answering those questions. I think, unless there are any further questions from the audience that anyone wants to raise their hand at this point, I think we'll move on to our next speaker.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker tonight is Dr. Natalie Jones, who's a research associate at the Center for Study of Existential Risk. And yeah, Natalie, you're sharing your screen already, so over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. Thanks to the organisers. Today, I'm going to tell you about a bit of research I have been doing with colleagues at the Stockholm Environment Institute, as well as the University of Auckland. And we are examining how countries are addressing the production of coal, oil and gas in documents that they submit under the Paris Agreement. And so that last question was really relevant to our work. So let me tell you briefly about why we are interested in this question. So to stay within a 1.5 or a 2 degree pathway, the world has to wind down the production of coal, oil and gas, we recently had reaffirmed from the International Energy Agency that under a 1.5 pathway, no new production infrastructure can be built. However, we also know that countries are currently planning to produce approximately twice as much coal, oil and gas than would be consistent with the 1.5 pathway. This is known as the production gap, and the latest report on the size of that gap actually came out this morning. But on the other hand, what is a little bit heartening is that in recent years, some countries have started to prepare and encourage a wind down in fossil fuel production. And there are various policies and measures that can be brought to bear here, including restricting exploration, eliminating subsidies, placing limitations on finance, and of course, supporting a just transition of workers and communities. And there is now also a coalition of first movers, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is spearheaded by Costa Rica and Denmark. The other part of the context of this is that over the past couple of years, countries have been in the process of updating their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And I'm sure most of you in the audience will already know what NDCs are, but just as a recap, they are countries' pledges under the Paris Agreement, and they typically contain a country's targets, policies, and actions to reduce emissions over a 5 or a 10-year period. And some also include information on adaptation, as well as means of implementation, such as finance. And back in 2014 through 2016, states who are parties to the UN Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement handed in their first round of NDCs. And then countries were required to submit either a second NDC or an updated version of their first NDC in advance of COP26. So obviously this was initially meant to be last year in 2020, but now it's been extended to 2021. And so far most, but not all countries have handed in their new or updated NDC. As well as NDCs, countries can hand in another kind of document, which is called the Long-Term Low Emissions Development Strategy, or LTLEDs for short, not really that short. This is optional rather than mandatory, like the NDCs, and it covers a longer time horizon, often running until 2050 or later, with the idea that this can help inform the shorter and the medium-term action and planning. And these documents are typically much more in-depth and contain a lot more analysis and modeling in support of their findings. And so far, because these are optional, a lot less countries have handed these in, but this does include major players like the EU and Canada, actually. So, crucially, both of these documents can provide a space where countries can plan their energy transitions and potentially communicate targets or policies or measures or pathways, not only for emissions reduction, but also for phasing out fossil fuel production. And they are also an important vehicle for normalizing a just and equitable transition away from such production, which in turn would enable the conditions for international cooperation on these issues. And we might expect that because there has been this increase in national policies around winding down production, this might be reflected in these international documents, because we now have these 2 rounds of NDCs and quite a number of LEDs, so it's a good time to take stock. So with this in mind, our research questions were, firstly, are countries actually including fossil fuel production in their NDCs and LEDs? If so, in what ways? What kinds of information are they including? Also, how has this changed over time, and in particular between the first and second rounds of NDCs? And finally, what can this tell us about how countries could include fossil fuel production in their NDCs and LEDs in the future? So a quick word on our methodology that we used. We read all the NDCs and LEDs by countries that produce fossil fuels. We had some keywords that we searched for, but we also just read all the documents to make sure we didn't miss anything relevant. In the first round, we read 57 NDCs, and we then read 38 in the second round. This discrepancy is because not all of the NDCs have been handed in yet, and this is also slightly old data. That I think this is as of July, and we have had a few more in since then. But the reason we haven't yet submitted an article into a journal is because we just haven't got all the data yet, and so this is a work in progress. We also read 19 LEDs, and we coded them. We basically extracted relevant pieces of text and we coded these according to categories that emerged as we were reading. And I'll talk more about these when I discuss the findings in a second. And yeah, there's this constraint that not all countries, including a few major producing states like China and Russia, haven't handed in their NDCs yet. So with that said, what did we find so far? So we found that in general, there are 8 kinds of references to fossil fuel production. The first is just information on like how much reserves a country has or how much oil it produces, for example. The second is specific targets in NDCs or pathways and LEDs for how a country will or could wind down fossil fuel production. The third is measures and policies to disincentivize or constrain production. The fourth is actually explicitly saying we are going to continue or even increase our production of coal, oil, and or gas, which is quite remarkable to find in these documents. I'll talk about a couple of examples of that later on. And the fifth one is related because it implies a continued production, especially when, as is the case, and I think every example we found, it like isn't actually accompanied by any indication that there might be a decrease in the amount of coal, oil, or gas extracted. Just measures to make existing production cleaner, whether in terms of mitigation or adaptation. We also found a category of references to what can broadly be termed transition planning, and I'll talk a bit more about those in detail. We then found a category which we termed equity, which is about the international equity between countries and how countries are thinking about that in relation to fossil fuel production. And then lastly, we found a category about international support and cooperation. And if we look at these in terms of the numbers, I've got a figure here that doesn't quite cover all of the categories, but basically the bars here represent the total number of documents we looked at, while the coloured portions in the bars reflect the number of documents that included this type of reference. And so on the left here you can see we have the total NDCs, and then we have a number of them that mentioned fossil fuel production specifically in the document anywhere at all. And so you can see that in the case of the NDCs in both rounds, it's about 2/3. And in the LEDs, it's actually slightly more than that. It's about 3/4. But then if we look at in terms of how many mentioned policies that specifically constrain fossil fuel production, it's a much smaller proportion. And also in terms of targets or pathways, it's still a small proportion. Whereas if you look at the number that imply continued or expanded production, that is much larger, especially in the first round. It looks like at the moment, it looks like it's less in the second round, but as I mentioned before, we don't have all the data yet. And then the number that talked about international cooperation and support is also quite low. And the dots here represent the extraction-based emissions of the countries. So you can see that the countries that, particularly in their first NDC, that have indicated continued or increased production, for example, that's quite high, whereas the kind of extraction-based emissions that countries are responsible for in the other categories is quite low. So let's talk about a couple of examples in the time I have remaining. which is not a lot. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. Let's touch on just one or two examples. So let's find an interesting one. So for instance, France in its LED, it has its national commitment to phase out all extraction of fossil fuels by 2040, which is good. Let's have one more example just before time is up. On the other hand, we have this Bangladesh. It aims to maximize its coal output. Fantastic, and it puts that in its NDC. So I have some other examples here on the slides, and if you're interested in reading our working papers, they are available, and there is much more information about this work in those. Thank you very much, and looking forward to any questions.
Thank you, Natalie, and sorry for the short amount of time there we have, because I was really interested to see some of those examples actually. And the question here from Markus, who's asking, do you think a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is needed?
Yeah, it's a good question. Short answer is yes. I think that would be good, because as stated, we have a number of countries who are the first movers on this, so it's kind of right time to be thinking about how they can cooperate on an international level. And crucially, what a treaty can do that not all countries acting individually can do is to create a bit of a managed element, because the research is also quite clear that if we leave each country to kind of wind its production down on its own, that actually doesn't have very good outcomes in terms of the affected workers and the communities who rely on this kind of extraction. And so countries, if they work together, can actually make better outcomes in terms of that just transition. And I think this is particularly relevant in the case of Canada, actually, just thinking of some research I've come across before. But yes, I think it's very much needed. I know there are active efforts, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how those progress.
Can I ask a quick supplementary
question?
So Natalie, would you then agree that including gas as a transition fuel in the green investment taxonomy by the European Union is a mistake? So are sort of all fossil fuels, not just coal, pretty dangerous? Yeah,
unfortunately it is gas that is a problem as well. I'm thinking of a report released by IISD earlier in the year called the Step Off Gas Report, which assesses basically how gas basically can't really be described as a transition fuel. Basically, gas investments really risk driving a new dash for gas that lock countries into a really high carbon pathway, which actually imperils their economic future as well as the climate. And they also found that gas isn't even needed because renewable based alternatives for most of its uses are either already cheaper or expected to be cheaper within a few years. And actually what countries in the global south, which might be struggling with energy access, what those countries really need is greater international support around clean energy. And I think the number is that, like, at the moment, the amount of international public finance that is going into gas in the global south is actually 4 times as much as clean energy. It's like a huge discrepancy. So I think we need a lot more focus on clean energy and less on gas. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to have to stop the Q&A there, unfortunately, because we need to leave. I want to keep time for our final speaker, but there is another question for you, Natalie, in the chat from Christopher. So maybe you could answer that one in the chat. And we'll move on now to our final speaker of today's session. Last but not least is Noparuj Chindasombachrun, who's a doctoral student in the Industrial Resilience Group in the Institute for Manufacturing. So over to you, Noparuj.
Thank you very much, Eric. So my name is Noparuj. I'm very happy to say that, Eric, you had a very good accent and pronouncing it very well. But you can call me by my nickname, which is New. I'm from the IFM, the Institute for Manufacturing from the Department of Engineering. Before we start, I want to thank Cambridge Zero and Eric for organizing this and giving me the opportunity to present today. So today I'll be presenting my research, which looks at sustainable technology adoption and the policies and technology transfer services available to induce adoption. So first, I would like to introduce the issue that my project will focus on, which is agricultural burning. So it is the burning of crop residues, such as rice straws, sugarcane leaves, either before or after harvest. And it is considered as a cheap and quick method to clear the fields for the next crop cycle, or specifically for sugarcane. It increases the speed and convenience of harvesting. Now, this is still a pretty big issue in Thailand and many of the developing countries. But in Thailand, almost 50% of sugarcanes sold to sugar mills last year were burned. Relatively outdated data from 2011 suggests that 70% of the rice fields in irrigated areas burned residues back at the time. But more recently, from the satellite imagery data on active fire hotspots, shows that rice fields have the highest occurrences of fire out of all the agricultural crops. And there are operational alternatives to this, which are machineries which allow more convenient collection or reuse of residues, while also being more profitable for farmers in the long run. Now, burning these residues are causing very big problems, and it is linked to the sustainability pillars. For economic, the fire from burning negatively affects many qualities of the soil. And so in the long run, burning reduces crop yields in future crop cycles. And also, as mentioned earlier, farmers have the opportunity to collect the residues and actually sell them for money. And so burning eliminates this opportunity. And next is the environmental consequences, where burning, of course, releases harmful greenhouse gas emissions. But more importantly, in this case, it releases black carbon, which are dust particles that lead to severe haze and smog. And this has been a very big problem in Thailand in recent years, as well as in other developing countries such as India. And these black carbons actually have hundreds or even 1,000 times higher impact in terms of global warming than carbon dioxide per unit of mass. And in terms of social health issues, that carbon, the particles are small enough such that they are able to penetrate in the human lungs. And this could cause many health problems, especially for people who already have respiratory conditions. And so this problem is essentially a classic example of market failure, where costs are pushed away from the private individuals and towards the environment and the society. And so governments around the world have for a long time realized this issue, and it is prohibited by law in most countries, including Thailand, of course. Although enforcement of the law is scarce in developing countries. But for Thailand, regulations were imposed through fines towards the sugarcane farmers, as well as sugar mills, and also in terms of support for giving out fixed rewards for not burning, and also having training facilities and low interest rates for machinery purchases. But despite these support and policies, many farmers still stick to the same method of burning. Therefore, from all of these regulations and support provided, the question is whether the price incentives, the access to technology or the knowledge are really the problem, and whether there are other limitations that are hindering adoption. If knowledge really is a problem, what is hindering farmers from understanding? And so we will try to answer these questions through the behavioral economics approach, which I will cover in the next few slides. And the latter part of my research will also look into the tools available to tackle these limitations, including policy and technology transfer services. So just a quick introduction to the concept of behavioral economics. We understand that economics tries to predict what happens in markets under many assumptions of human rationality. But behavioral economics argues that these rationalities are not always present, and that a lot of the times there are behavioral limitations that occur subconsciously within the human mind, as studied in psychology, that actually affects economic decision making. And having just started my second year, I have not done the field work yet, but we will see two examples of how behavioral economics has been applied to agriculture adoption research. So first is present bias. So Esther Duflo and her peers have looked into the problem of low fertilizer adoption in Kenya. And she explained that the traditional approach that policymakers often use is to make assumptions as to why there are low adoption. And the classic assumptions are the limited access to these fertilizers. It could be that the fertilizers are expensive and it's not feasible for farmers to purchase it, or that the farmers do not know the benefits of using fertilizers. But from preliminary research, the researchers found that it's not always the case, and the farmers actually stated that they intend to use fertilizers in the next crop cycle. But what the researchers found is that using the behavioral approach, they found that farmers received income during the harvest season, while the fertilizers were usually bought during the next planting season. So there is a small time gap. And so there are two key phenomena here. One is that farmers procrastinate when deciding to purchase fertilizers before they actually need it. So they don't purchase it yet. And farmers cannot resist the temptation to spend money on irrelevant things when it is readily available. And this is actually due to present bias, which is when you put more weight into the near future than in the far future. So it exists to a certain extent in situations where you have to face some effort or some cost now, but the benefits come later in the future. And so a classic example here is going to the gym for all of us. We all know that we don't want to go to the gym, but we want a good body. And so the behavioral solution is to offer a commitment device, which is a small time-limited incentive right after harvest season. So right when they have the money. And this was actually more effective than offering 50% subsidy on fertilizers at the application time. The second one is loss aversion, which is a part of the prospect theory, which is the tendency to avoid losses than to receive an equivalent amount of gain, where a loss of a certain amount is actually more painful to an individual than a gain of an equivalent amount, as seen on the utility graph on the left. And linking it to farmers and technology adoption, it means that they require a much greater potential gain from technology adoption that greatly outweighs the potential losses in order to adopt technology. And this effect is amplified because of the financial standings of the farmers, where they have high debt levels, they have low frequency of income, which means that a loss of income from a single crop season could be detrimental. And actually, research shows that in certain scenarios, farmers only consider potential losses, albeit the very obvious benefits. And so just to end the presentation, current government interventions are focused on solving this issue through traditional approach, as I have presented earlier, through improving access, knowledge of farmers, or from subsidies and rewards given to farmers. But the behavioral approach to government interventions could be a more cost-effective way of inducing behavioral change, which results in what they call nudging policies that add to the spectrum of carrots and sticks option of government legislations and policies. And this could be applicable to many other types of sustainability interventions as well. Thank you very much. That would conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions and hear your thoughts about the issue.
Thank you very much, Markus, for an excellent presentation and really interesting research. So, and yeah, any questions from the audience, please put them in the chat now, or raise your hand if you want to just ask a question in person. That's also good. you said you were going to do some field work next. So where is your field work going to be located, and which areas of the world are you going to be looking at?
So it's going to be based in Thailand, where there are actually a lot of smallholder farmers who still are engaged in burning, because from the agriculture, from the sector, the farmers, sorry. The agriculture sector of Thailand is made up of a lot of smallholder farmers rather than big farmers like in the Western world. And so the problem is kind of more pronounced in Thailand or in other developing countries. But my research will be focused in Thailand.
Okay, great. Cool. Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing more about your research and your project as it progresses. Any further questions for Nupurush from the audience? Please raise your hand now. Otherwise, I think we'll call. Oh, you are raising a hand there, Lata, not a virtual hand. Go ahead, Lata.
Thank you. That was a great talk, New. Thanks a lot. I had a quick question. Where do governments normally get their advice from? Is it NGOs or is it other think tanks? And does it differ between Western nations and countries like India or Thailand? And can governments be provided with a toolkit on a behavioural approach treatment for a range of different agricultural practices or other different biases?
Right. Thank you very much for the question. So yeah, farmers are learning a lot from many entities. So of course, one is the government, who is organizing a lot of seminars or talks, or actually going down to the fields and demonstrating a lot of technology to farmers. Apart from governments, in some type of crops, the farmers there is a very developed system of contract farming, and so the agribusinesses actually not only just purchase the crops, but they also actually go down and provide them with not only financial linkages, but also with the knowledge as well. And so in terms of the general knowledge for farming, that is what they are already doing. But in terms of behavioral, I think in Thailand, we have not been looking so much in terms of countering the behavioral issues regarding farmers. I have not looked into the more of the Western world regarding what they're doing in terms of extension. But from reading the research papers, there are also issues regarding behavioral adoption and regarding how extensions are not actually considering the behavioral limitations of farmers as well.
So the behavioral approach is a novel approach everywhere.
Yeah, in fact, this type of research has been done for a few years. However, I don't think it has gone through to the policy level just yet.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lata, for the question, and Nupurush. And there's another question here in the chat from Libby, who's asking whether the small farmers who your project focuses on, whether they sell to large agribusinesses.
Yeah, so there are many types. There are also large and small. So if you look at the sugarcane, for example, take the sugarcane. As I mentioned, that the contract farming is quite developed for the sugarcane crop. A lot of the sugarcane producers are actually quite large, and so they have the capacity to go down and teach the farmers about new technology. They also have the power to actually provide what do you call it? So like be the collateral for funding. No, not for funding. Sorry, for loans from the banks for the farmers as well. And so that is one type of extension that is benefiting the farmers a lot, which I will also have to look into.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nupurush. That was really interesting talk, and thanks for answering all those questions as well. So I think we're going to have to call it a day there now, and I'm aware we're already 10 minutes over time and people have other things to go to, I'm sure. I've put a few links in the chat there for the program for our upcoming research symposia. So we have, we don't have one next week, but then we've got quite a few more sessions throughout November and one at the start of December as well. So please do come along to those, and do also sign up for our research mailing list if you're not already on that. And I would just like to end by thanking everyone, all the speakers for the really excellent presentations and all the excellent questions and discussion that's been in the chat. It's been really interesting to hear about all your work and see all the discussion going on. And thanks also for the audience and for your questions as well from the audience, and for sticking around. It's really much appreciated. So with that, I'll end this session. Thank you all, and hopefully see you at our next symposium in a couple of weeks. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.